Well, welcome everyone to this webinar on what we know about cannabis, especially in relationship to the reproductive years. And we're very grateful to have the opportunity to be able to talk with you today a bit about some of the things we know and don't know about cannabis in the reproductive years, and are very happy to have the funding and support from the Public Health Agency of Canada to provide this information to you. And lots of you have expressed interest, so it's very exciting. Now, my name is Nancy Poole, and I'm the Director of the Center of Excellence for Women's Health, which is a basically a virtual research network these days, but hosted by BC Women's Hospital in Vancouver. And I also act as the prevention lead for the Canada FASD Research Network, and some of you may have seen me speak about FASD before, and I'm just really privileged to have had the funding for almost 10 years now to lead a national network of researchers and practitioners and policy analysts and birth mothers who are interested in the prevention of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And more recently, I've been also working on a number of pan-Canadian projects that are specifically looking at trauma, gender, and substance use, and the interconnections and the importance of interventions that link all three of those things as we're doing work on substance use issues. Now, I'm really happy to have two panelists here with me today. Karen Mason from the Family Treatment Center in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and Bev Drew, who's the FASD Prevention Coordinator with the Fast Prevention Institute. And they're going to jump in a bit later with me as we answer questions and comments that you hopefully are going to type in as we go along, so that we will be able to answer them as we go. Now, I think you saw the instructions for doing that as you came in, but there is a box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen there where you can type in questions. And as I said, we'll keep an eye on them and answer them as we nearer the end. So, here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk a little bit about cannabis in the reproductive years, and then we're going to talk first of all about the implications for our prevention work and the sort of general messages that we're giving out about cannabis use in the reproductive years. And then we're going to talk a bit about promising practice in having discussions and conversations with women and their partners. And we'll also get some examples from the panelists about how brief support is playing out in their context on this issue. So the Center of Excellence for Women's Health did a bit of research for the Best Start group in Ontario, and who wanted us to look at the effects of cannabis in the perinatal period. And you can see on the left-hand side there the four of us from the center who looked into that research. And we tried to just go into the literature and see what was being said about fertility, pregnancy, birth outcomes, breastfeeding, child development, and parenting in relationship to cannabis use. And this research became the underpinning of this resource that you can see pictured here, that you can download from the Best Start website, or you can also order print copies from them. Now, you'll notice we only found 60 articles, and that may seem like a lot, but actually in the research world, that's not that many. And I think that's one of the things you're going to see a little bit today is the fact that not nearly enough research has been done on cannabis use. Now, one of the things that we looked at was anything that could tell us a bit about the impacts of cannabis use in pregnancy and the immediate birth outcomes. And I've organized the findings in 2 columns here because I just think it's really interesting to point out something that isn't always done in research, which is that, you know, we saw some studies that talked about, for instance, low birth weight being associated with cannabis use in pregnancy. But if you look on the column next to it, you'll see we saw even more studies that actually didn't find a significant association of low birth weight and marijuana or cannabis use in pregnancy. And you'll see the same thing in preterm birth and stillbirth, et cetera. And many of you may have already seen a lot of materials that have been put out that have said, oh, these are the effects. And yes, if you just looked at the studies in the one column, you could say, yes, there are studies that say that. But I think it's really important for us to think about the fact that, you know, there's also studies that haven't found those things. And so we're really in a place of not knowing a great deal at this point. One of the things you'll see down near the bottom was the effects of cannabis use in pregnancy is, you know, babies being placed in the NICU, in the neonatal intensive care units. And it's interesting that some people see that as an effect or an outcome, but, you know, I think it's important for us to recognize that, you know, those decisions about going to the NICU are very much made in a context with people with attitudes about whether that's necessary or not, et cetera. So I wouldn't normally include that as an outcome area. And but I did see someone present at a conference in the U.S. recently who included that as a key outcome without any critical analysis. So yeah, lots of questions still wide open for us. And I think the same thing is true. I guess you can't really see the top of this. I sort of went off the slide a bit here around the issue of the outcomes in childhood as well. And you'll see that some studies found no association with cognitive function, and some studies did find associations with subtle negative effects on school performance and, you know, various other delinquency issues, et cetera. So, you know, most of those studies, the one from Holland, and that was done by El Meron and et al., that's an ongoing study, so that may tell us more than anything. The other studies from the U.S. there and the OPS study for Canada were done, are both longitudinal studies, but they were done some time ago, and you know, I think really focused on marijuana use that was smoking and at the various potency levels that were available at the time. So I think there's lots for us to think about in terms of understanding the outcomes. People also want to know about breastfeeding and the impact of cannabis on cannabis use on breastfeeding. There's some issues mentioned in animal studies about it inhibiting lactation. One Canadian systematic review reported some infant developmental delays at year 1. And then there are also studies that she looked at in this whole collection of in the systematic review that found no effects. So really, lots of questions around breastfeeding as well. And in the case of cannabis use, people have also talked about it being very much confounded by prenatal use. as well. So, and the fact that ongoing use, cannabis doesn't leave the body, it's stored in the body much longer than, for instance, alcohol. And many of you may know that, you know, our recommendations around alcohol is that if you are going to drink while breastfeeding, to kind of manage it by the timing of alcohol leaving your body and, you know, trying to organize around that. And it's not so possible with cannabis because it doesn't leave the body as quickly. But for me, the main associations that we thought was quite interesting were the impacts on parenting, and people mentioning the fact that, you know, it affects your interactions with your children, and then possibly, you know, early attachment. There is risk of accidental use by children. There's risks around you as a parent driving kids while to various appointments, etc., that when you're high. So there's lots of things to be thought about in terms of cannabis use and early parenting, and that became a kind of a big section of the Best Start booklet. And, you know, I just wanted to mention that there has been a qualitative study done that you can see here, and that some parents really mentioned in that study a number of harm reduction strategies that they were using, like using less potent strains of marijuana, prioritizing their family and work, in the sense of not getting high when you needed to be doing having these other responsibilities, and not mixing it with tobacco, and that the use of tobacco and cannabis mixed together and often called in blunts can really make for a much more potent mixture. So, you know, we are really in early stages in terms of understanding the effects of cannabis, and there are a lot of confounding factors when we try and study cannabis use in the reproductive years. First of all, as many of you may know, it's really hard to find somebody who only uses cannabis, that, you know, the use of tobacco and alcohol and other substances really confounds what we might be the actual outcomes for related to cannabis alone. And as you know, that alcohol and tobacco have very negative impacts on offspring when used in pregnancy, and also on women's health. So really important for us, I think, to be recognizing, you know, the additive effects of using multiple substances. The other things, you know, some of the studies used, especially those longitudinal studies looking at effects on child development, were done with largely middle-class white families. So, you know, we don't really have a lot of good information about people facing multiple burdens that may be higher than with middle-class families. And so, you know, lots to be factored in that way as well. There hasn't been a lot of great studies, you know, large studies, and, you know, we haven't got any clinical trials. We're relying a lot on women's self-report on how much they use. We don't have a lot of data on how much women used or how potent it was, or we have no studies so far on other forms of ingestion other than smoking. And, yeah, and we have a lot of challenges in sort of interpreting the animal studies, because it's hard to figure out, you know, exactly how much is an equivalent amount. amount with mice or whatever type of animal you're using in the animal studies. So I hate to be, really so negative, but we don't really know a lot. And even though we don't know a lot, I feel like people are starting to interpret the effects. And here's two. One is a kind of a report, and the other is a book here that were looked at the same studies that I just showed and a few others as well, and came to very different conclusions. One of them saying there's mixed evidence for association with decreased birth weight, such as I said today, and the other saying there's substantial evidence of an association with lower birth weight. So one saying there is moderate evidence of association with reduced cognitive function in children, and the other saying there's insufficient evidence of an association with later outcomes related to SIDS, cognition, academic achievement, and later substance use. So that's a bit of a challenge for us, is to have all this in place. So what do we do about this? And this picture on the top here is one of our efforts at the Center of Excellence to try and summarize for service providers what we actually do know about cannabis in your health, cannabis in pregnancy, cannabis in breastfeeding, et cetera. And you can download that sheet from our website. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but in terms of messaging, I think we can really draw a lot on kind of some of the things we know and interventions from our work on alcohol and pregnancy. And that is that we do need organizations like Bev's organization that's really oriented around broad awareness building and health promotion efforts. There's a lot of work on trying to give good messaging, and the SATS Prevention Institute also works a lot on this promoting confidence and competence for providers to have discussions on alcohol and other issues as well. And she'll talk a bit more about that as we go along. But I think, this idea of multi-level interventions with a real focus on level 1 and level 2 to begin with, and also, of course, the level 3 and 4 interventions are available. That specialized programming for higher risk women and women with addictions. And Karen's treatment center in Prince Albert is really well positioned to help women at higher risk who are new mothers who may have used cannabis in pregnancy. So really thinking as we go along that we need all these things to come together as we go along. Now, in the messaging in the U.S., when we looked at a bunch of the websites, some public health agency-type websites, we saw that few of them really covered the scientific uncertainty. And so I think, we have a challenge before us to be able to present the uncertainty and also give messages. Now, the exception to that is Colorado has done quite a bit of work on public awareness, and their Good to Know campaign. I think they have a range of information, and I think they've really tried to present a very even-handed view, and you can see there brings you a bundle of joy and brings you a bundle of questions, and I think that's a good way of presenting it to you. Now, in Canada, there are a few places to go to get some basic messaging. The Best Start resource I mentioned to you, the Canada FASD Research Network has an info sheet. the Center of Excellence for Women's Health has the Women in Cannabis sheet, and the SOGCs are kind of in the background there. They have a statement on cannabis as well, and I know that they're just working on public health messaging and videos, et cetera, at this point too. So I feel like lots of people are jumping in to be part of the story now and to think about what are we doing. But we really need further research on these things. You know, the different amounts being used, the potency, the methods of ingestion, the timing during pregnancy, et cetera. We need to think about medical and therapeutic use, as well as low and moderate use in pregnancy. We need to think about dad's cannabis use. In the research, we need to be able to line up and align the self-reports with biomarkers. And we need to figure out how to isolate the impacts of cannabis use alone. So, you know, lots for us to still be able to do. But, you know, given this, here's my, you know, takeaway message is that I think that given that we don't have good evidence yet and we don't really know the risks, what we should be saying is the safest approach is to not use cannabis when you're trying to conceive and during pregnancy and breastfeeding, and to take precautions while parenting. And, you know, I think that message is the safest not to is one we've used in alcohol, too, because we haven't known the absolute, you know, if there is a safe level to use in pregnancy. Some studies say that absolutely any is a problem for alcohol, and others say that, you know, it's more a case of the heavier use. So I think that, you know, that messaging around it's safest not to, but really coming at it, and I think this is especially true in cannabis, in a non-judgmental way, and really opening the dialogue with women. And I think because cannabis is seen as a much more benign product that by the public, in general, that if we come in big guns with, you know, it's a risk, don't do it kind of thing, and that kind of absolutist way, rather than inviting discussion of saying, you know, here's what we know and don't know, and what does that mean for you? What's your take on, you know, whether you want to stop using or reduce your use, and think about other ways of meeting your needs that cannabis gives you, et cetera. So I think those are the kinds of things we really want to invite dialogue, and we want to address the issue of the risks of multiple substance use in pregnancy, and you know, talk about the risks and benefits, and really, you know, think about these issues when parenting of safe storage and early attachment and safe driving without being high. So that's sort of as definitive as I can get, but I'm sure many of you who are delivering services out there already understand that there's no black and white in substance use. It's all gray, and that really, you know, inviting discussion is the very best way forward. So I'm going to turn to talk about the best way, you know, that brief intervention thing now, but I really wanted to just point out that we not only did those sheets on cannabis, but also on alcohol, tobacco and prescription painkillers as well that you can download from our website. And again, it's really meant more for you as service providers just to have some, confidence in what you're saying about each of those substances. And in some cases, you may share it with women, but they're not really meant as handouts for women. But I will come to handouts for women as we go along. Now, the third part and final part that I said I was going to talk about was this idea of brief support, or brief intervention as it's sometimes called. And I think, that's a really important thing for us to be thinking about. And we use these particular principles for brief support when we were helping Alberta Health Services recently design some interventions for tobacco use in the reproductive years. And you can download this from their website. It's Baby Steps, I think it's the name of the resource that we worked on. But really thinking, as usual, about how do we center it around the woman, not only being a message about the impact on children, but to think about linking women-centered and child-centered work. To think about being open to harm reduction and not just really promoting abstinence only, but trying to invite discussion about reducing as well as stopping and starting where women are at. Really thinking about equity issues, such as poverty and trauma, et cetera, and thinking about trauma-informed approaches always, recognizing that many people use substances to mitigate the impacts of trauma, and that, we can be very aware of that and aware of not re-traumatizing people as we're talking about brief support. So, I think, there's lots we already know about brief support on cannabis, and we've had the opportunity with funding from the Public Health Agency of Canada recently to do a national project about brief support on all 4 of those substances that I mentioned above. And we really did want to inspire health and social care providers to incorporate brief intervention in their daily practice with girls and women and their partners, and in order to improve women's health and men's health, and also to prevent fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. We engaged these 8 types of providers in discussions in 13 regional meetings across the country, and really had some great discussions about what it is for each of these type of workers to do brief support. And, we spent lots of time sharing academic information such as the bibliography on the CAMSAT site and the Alberta Health Services work, where we looked at the 5 A's of intervening on tobacco and tried to bring these principles into delivering those 5A types of interventions on tobacco, and to think about the link between these interventions, because we've developed them in a lot of different substances, but haven't always united the interventions in the end. Now, I wanted to mention that there are a number of studies coming forth, fairly recent ones, on brief support and using motivational interviewing and mindfulness approaches, but, that come from the trauma-informed and from the other substance use areas as being effective, and it makes good sense that they would also have some good outcomes in this context as well when we're discussing cannabis. And on the other side of the page here, I just wanted to mention a workbook that has been developed by Pathways Research in Winnipeg, and you can have a look at them at healthylivingworkbook.com, and you can order them, but they're quite, I don't know, 20 pages long or so, but they're really meant for people to work through some of their relationship to cannabis, what it gives, what it takes away, the changes they want to make, what they're already doing, what their plan might be. And I really like the fact that it kind of puts in women's and men's hands their own, thinking and reflection on how they want to make choices about cannabis. And I think that's the kind of thing you could have as service providers copies of to be able to walk through with clients to support them and encouraging them to go away and think it through and work a bit more on it. I just wanted to mention the Level 3 programs in terms of support that is deeper support than just brief, but just wanted to mention that many of the pregnancy outreach programs in Saskatchewan and Manitoba are really working from these principles of wrapping care around the mother-child unit and doing it in a way that includes principles of being relational, kind, women-centered, harm reduction-oriented, trauma-informed, and culturally grounded, et cetera. And I think, these things have worked in general for all substances, and there's no reason why they won't be important to us as we help women with cannabis problems, as opposed to women just thinking about cannabis use in pregnancy in the Level 1 and 2 work. And really hope that we can continue to advance the work of these programs. And are just wanting to let you know we are doing an evaluation right now of a number of the programs across Canada, and including the Mothering Project in Winnipeg and Raising Hope in Regina. And those programs have all said that these elements are really important: the outreach, practical support, harm reduction, integrated approaches, care for them, both mothers and children, not pitting the interests of those two, and to really thinking about trauma and safety as we do the work. I think it's really helpful for brief support as well as intensive support. And those trauma-informed approaches, always really critical for us to be thinking about. And I just put the picture of a title of an article I wrote a number of years ago on responses to substance use in women, and just really recognizing that we often are highly judgmental, and that really our approach should be much more on validating their interests and moving forward with listening to what's working for them, helping them with the choices that they're trying to make as mothers and as pregnant women. And just really important for us always to be thinking about the wisdom from traditional Indigenous ways of knowing, and taking wellness-oriented approaches and strength-based approaches that are so deeply rooted in those traditions. And we've been working quite a bit on how to do trauma-informed and Indigenous approaches to FASD prevention in Indigenous communities. And you can download some of those things from our website on wellness and Indigenous mothering, etc. And also from Colleen Dell's site in Saskatchewan on the big national project we did with the NADAC treatment programs about Indigenous wellness approaches to substance use problems. So really, I think always honoring the wisdom there, and I think it's really something we could bring more thoroughly into work with all women, not only Indigenous women. And, you know, I think our last challenge I just wanted to mention before turning it over to answering discussions and comments, I guess, is to think about the importance of including and child welfare as we do our thinking about substance use in women. And it's going to be a big move for them as well as us to be thinking about how we move from an illicit substance and something that's seen as a problem to something that's seen as legal. And I think it's really important for us to be trying to change this idea that all substance use is a problem for parenting, but instead to be thinking about, you know, how important parenting is and really helping people be the best parents they can be, even if they're using substances, and trying to help them use in a way that isn't detrimental to parenting, and to bring all of us working in different locations along in our thinking about respectful support of women who use substances during pregnancy, including cannabis. So lots for us to think about, I think, as we go forth. So, you know, that's kind of all I wanted to say about those challenges and opportunities for us. And just wanted now to, I guess, open it up to people's questions and comments about this. Not seeing a lot here. Let me just close the participants for a second so I can see better. So I see one here, mostly about timing of the webinar. Let's see. Let's talk a little bit about the fathers part of it, because I see that's one of the questions. And there are some discussions of fathers. I think we need to include lots more around fathers, and certainly around their use as parents, and that idea of secondhand smoke as well. And we did in the study see lots of challenges around fathers and fertility issues, and some indication that cannabis may impact fertility for men. So, you know, not so much during pregnancy, but the idea of can you get pregnant when you're using cannabis heavily. So again, not really imperfect studies, but I think the issue of fathers is a really important one. And I don't know, Bev, whether you've had a chance in your work to be able to think about brief support with fathers as well.
I think that in particular, fathers have a real social influence with their partners. And we find the same thing with alcohol. You know, that if fathers are drinking or smoking cannabis, their partners are more likely to do the same. So when a father supports a woman in whatever way is helpful, then she's likely to reduce her use. Stop.
Yeah. So I think, you know, the more we can bring fathers in, the better. And I think it's put in just in relational issues as well, and helping fathers being good caregivers and not sort of gendering the way we do parenting and pregnancy so thoroughly, with it being all women's responsibility, but really trying to think about including fathers and at every stage, and being supportive and in thinking about their own use and the impact that'll have on their parenting. So big check on the father's issue. Now the next one on use of medical cannabis, there hasn't been a lot of studies. One of the things myths I do need to dispel, though, is that some women use cannabis in pregnancy for thinking that it will help with nausea. And while there's a lot of sort of qualitative reports of that being helpful, the science has not found that to be true to date. So that, if people say, oh, well, I'm using it for nausea, I really recommend that women talk to their healthcare providers about finding as many other options as they can for morning sickness or nausea, because the science isn't backing that up to date. But, you're right around the medical use, and I think where women are using cannabis for pain, there'll be lots of questions as we go forth about whether they want to reduce their use in pregnancy and find other ways of coping with pain as well. We don't have the studies yet to really understand the medical use versus the recreational use, and we don't have the studies that show, the various forms of ingestion that sometimes the medical cannabis tends to be done more in lotions and potions, et cetera. So we've still lots to learn, I think, in that way. The third one I see there area is on the secondhand smoke, and yes, there are some early studies showing secondhand smoke as an issue, and clearly we know from the tobacco field that secondhand smoke is a big problem, and there are chemicals in cannabis smoke as well, and so not recommended to smoke in vicinity of children. So lots to, so much we don't know yet definitively, but that one is one way where we are seeing some studies that it is of concern. And it makes sense, in terms of the impact of secondhand smoke in tobacco. Karen, I don't know whether you want to really mention anything about what you're seeing in terms of women's reflections about cannabis use in the context of the treatment center in PA. Oh, I think you're still on mute there. We're not hearing you, Karen. Are you there?
There you are.
Yeah.
I promised I was here the whole time. So what we do in Prince Albert is we're a women's treatment center, and we bring in 8 women at a time, and their children come with them that are ages 12 and under, and they stay for a 6-week stay with us as an inpatient treatment program. So our population is a bit different in that we are working with people that have either identified themselves or had someone else identify for them that they're struggling with substances. And some of the trends that we see is that women are using cannabis a lot of times to cope with the effects of trauma, cannabis and other substances. And a lot of our work focuses on identifying those impacts of trauma for women, teaching them to identify, teaching grounding, emotional regulation skills, as well as some traditional types of addiction treatment. And we certainly take a harm reduction approach with women, and it's certainly about speaking with them about their needs. We have noticed that for some women, using cannabis as opposed to using heavier drugs or alcohol is seen as less harmful. And for a lot of women, depending where they are in their state of readiness when they come in, that is sometimes an approach that they take, and I think they see it as harmless. We have ladies who are quite sure that there is no risk to baby, and so the way that we work with that, or the way that we address that, is through conversations with our RN and our nurse practitioner. We're very fortunate to have a nurse practitioner who attends our treatment center once a week. And so she is able to build really good relationships with women over the 6-week period that we're here. And those conversations happen with every one of our clients that come in from preconception to pregnancy. And I think that relationship is really a key part of women being able to open up and discuss the questions and some of the myths that they have and what they need to know for support. Did I answer your question, Steve?
Yeah, I think that's great. And, you know, it ties into the question on the list here that, you know, that there's a mindset because we don't have a lot of information that it must be okay. And I think, you know, that's the challenge, is to be able to say to people, you know, we're still learning things about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. You know, I think the young folks who, you know, have been interviewing each other recently and pointing out the wide range of physical health problems as well as the brain injury related to FAS, I think is really, really important. And so I feel like over time, once you know something, you know, once you can study something like FASD, we learn more and more. And I think that given the fact that we don't know right now does not mean that it's okay. The fact that we don't know right now just means that we don't know because we haven't been able to study it because it has been illegal. And it's a great moment for us to be able to say, now that it's legal, we'll be able to understand it more because we'll be able to do studies and people will feel safer to report their use. So I think, you know, your nurse is really good in that way.
And we certainly share that belief with them, and that it's not recommended, but nor do we get hooked into an argument. It's your body, it's your life, you know, it's your choice. But what do you need? Like we find when we bring it back to why are you here? Why are you at treatment? What are the things that you need to improve for you and your family? Why did you come to treatment in the first place? For that will change our discussion into something where it's not a argumentative approach, but it's a what do you need, right?
Yeah.
Well, I do need to smoke less, or I do need to be using less, or you know, sometimes they do make the choice for abstinence partway through the program, and I think shifting that discussion to what's happened, or what do you need, or what do you need to improve your life, or to be healthier, or to what gains do you want to make, for us, that's a very helpful approach.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I jump in there?
Please do.
Brief intervention and motivational interviewing, that is just perfect, what you're doing, Karen. You know, you're getting the woman to make her own arguments for change instead of trying to convince her to change. And that is the most effective way. We all know, you know, if someone tells us to stop eating chocolate and lose weight, well, it's our natural response to get our back up and say, you know, who are you to tell me what to do? And it's the same for any woman, any man. You know, it's just our natural human response to resist being told what to do. So the best strategy is to, you know, evoke from the person why they would want to make a change, what's most important to them. You know, really get at their their values and their dreams for their family and for themselves. And that will help them convince themselves that they could make a change and it might be better for their family.
Well, and they'll come up with solutions that we never would have dreamed of that will work for them. So,
yeah. So a really good question to ask is, what have you heard about cannabis use and its effect? And then listen to what they say, and then you have an opportunity to understand, do they have some myths that they're carrying around? Do they think it's absolutely harmless? And then you can go from there. Would it be okay with you if I share a little bit of information from what researchers are telling us, and then you can talk about the mixed results and the recommendations that it's really safest not to use cannabis during pregnancy, and et cetera. And then find out from them, what do you make of that? What do you think of that information, and how would that work for you? So once again, you're allowing them to decide and make a choice.
Yeah, I think that approach has been so helpful with all the other substances as well. And, proven in so many randomized controlled trials, that idea of evoking people's ideas for change, working collaboratively. So, I think you've answered that question really well about, do you have a strategy to help introduce the topic of cannabis use, that idea of what do you know, and can I tell you more, and I'm just really also hoping that people will integrate some of the discussion with other substances as well, and be able to say, and while we're talking about cannabis, what do you know also about prescription painkillers and alcohol and tobacco and other things that you may be taking along with cannabis, and really help people sort that out instead of it being these completely siphoned off, siloed off, whatever interventions, to bring it all together a bit and to help people understand what substances are giving them and what they're taking away and where they come down. So really appreciate your thoughts on that, Bev.
Thank you. Another good strategy is to normalize the question. We ask every woman who comes to our program about the substances they're using during pregnancy. So is it okay if I ask you these questions, and then you proceed, so that it doesn't make her feel like she's being centered out, that you ask every woman, and that can help.
Yeah. Now the question here about one joint or whatever, heavy and light use, etc., I think is a really tricky one that I stay away from, because just to go back once again to alcohol, for many years, people started interventions on alcohol in pregnancy with, how many drinks do you drink a day kind of thing. And we assumed that people knew what a standard drink was, right? And felt safe to tell, and many other things. And I think that approach that you've just talked about, Bev, was what do you know about the effects of alcohol in pregnancy or cannabis in pregnancy or whatever, is such a much better sort of relational one to begin with, that doesn't require people to quantify their use, given that that may be very difficult to do. And in the case of cannabis, it's particularly difficult to do because of the potency of one joint over another kind of thing. So those studies in the past that you're quite right, say heavy use is one or more joints a day, is really, not that helpful to us in terms of amount. And so I think, we're on much firmer ground to be able to say, there's studies that say that it's related to low birth weight and other problems in child development, and others that aren't, but really, it's important for you to to think through your substance use and where you want to be with your mothering. And that's really, I think, a more useful approach than trying to quantify at this point. We may learn more down the road, but at this point I don't think we can really rely on asking about amounts. Mm-hmm. We don't have a definitive thing either on the timelines for when cannabis leaves the body. It is stored in fat, though, so it's much longer. And you remember that, or may remember that there's been a number of Olympic athletes and people in various other situations that have noted just how long it stays in the body, and people in drug testing in workplaces, et cetera. It really depends on a lot of things like body size and genetics and whole range of stressors, et cetera, other substances being used, and so I think we're again not able to say definitively how what the timeline is. I think that will come sooner than some of the other information. Is having more ideas about that as we're able to do studies and control for amounts and when it's discharged from the body. But so far, not so much. But I agree, Murray, with your comments as well, that we really need to help people who are using medical cannabis to control stress and pain and other things, and to really help them sort through what they want to do in the context of pregnancy. So lots for us to do in this kind of relational way of working, as opposed to only relying on the science and the quantities and timing and those kinds of things. So I think it's much more a responsibility of all of us to open the conversation and to recognize, like Karen has said, that really it may well be a case where people are really feeling like it's no problem at all, and you're just being a negative Nelly and even opening the conversation. And so I think it requires us to come at this one with an understanding that, unlike, for instance, tobacco, there are some benefits to marijuana use that people have identified. And so, it's a matter of seeing both benefits and drawbacks and weighing the two and making some choices for yourself. And that's, that I think requires us to get really good at the kind of brief support you've talked about, Bev, is to really feel like we can, for instance, stand in the place of helping people walk through. And I think that's why some of these things, like I mentioned, the little booklet on making choices about cannabis can be really helpful, because it's really built on a motivational interviewing approach. And that idea of kind of thinking about more than one substance at a time and really being able to give people encouragement in terms of, if they have been able to quit using tobacco, what worked in terms of doing that, and are there any lessons from there that can be brought into the cannabis place, and weighing in on that.
Yeah, certainly communicating their past successes out loud, like you say, is very powerful, and really seeing their strengths and mentioning them out loud, can really empower a person and make them feel like, yeah, I am good at this. I can change, I can do this. So it really goes a long way to build confidence about change. The other thing I might mention, if I could, is if you come up against a person who is really resistant about even talking about it, they don't want to go there, a good strategy is to just reflect that back. You're wondering, who am I to ask you about your cannabis use or whatever, and you're right. It's totally up to you whether you use cannabis or not. So you're providing them verbally with, you understand it's their choice, right? It's your decision what you do. I just wonder if we could have a short 5-minute conversation about cannabis, would that be okay with you? So asking their permission to open that conversation when they're a bit resistant can really help. Most people will say, oh, okay, they'll agree to that because it's a reasonable request, and you're giving them the choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I always want to come back to the work that you're doing, Karen, on cultural interventions, and to really honor the wellness-oriented approaches that we know have been so important in our work with Indigenous women. And I know there's a lot, the majority of women who come to the Family Treatment Center are Indigenous women. And I'm just wondering about, those strategies around Indigenous mothering, wellness, community-wide approaches, alternative approaches like healthy life on the land, et cetera, how those might play into what we're doing here.
Thanks, Nancy. I think so what we do is we offer times that our ladies go out and they speak with an elder, and we have culture as a component of our programming. But I think what we know is that women need more support than just for us just to give a traditional addiction treatment where here's a PowerPoint and here are your things and off you go. Part of it is that connection. We know that when they head into aftercare, part of it is the connection to culture and tradition. For many women, that's important. And we work with an elder here who is able to refer on to other people in the community that can fill that role for them as they leave treatment. We obviously can't fix a lot of things in 6 weeks. We need those community supports and interventions. And we do as much to make sure that they're connected to community. So if we have a community where they're doing cooking classes or they're doing connection to the people in their communities that are doing well, we certainly make those connections. Is that what you're asking about, Nancy, or was there another programming?
Yeah.
And we make sure that if it's just a holistic, it's a whole needs approach, and so it just is very dependent on who walks in our door. And if it's someone that we expose them to culture while they're here or another piece of programming, that's what they want to use to build on their wellness with, then that's kind of the discharge plan or the treatment plan we make for them. And we have people who come in who just really need housing. We have folks who come in who don't have a driver's license, that haven't filled out an income tax form or had a baby check, or sometimes it's about housing and finances as they leave as much as anything. And it's just really those practical supports and listening to people.
Yeah.
If a client has a need that we're not meeting, we need to get a plan in place for that, because they're telling us what they need to succeed with cannabis use, with any use. And so Did that answer your question, Nancy?
Yeah, and I guess I'm just coming back to that idea that it's really important for us not to be only focused on substances, even though this is about cannabis. Just trying to, you know, constantly remind ourselves that it is about being collaborative and relational and non-traumatizing. It is about being culturally grounded and thinking about things from a larger place than only the substance. And I think, you know, that's the challenge in this work in the perinatal period, is that, you know, it's so often really oriented on very specific medical and substance-oriented issues, and you know, the work to achieve these broader elements of interaction is sometimes forgotten because we're so busy trying to check off, you know, how many drinks does she drink a day kind of thing. So just wanted to leave with that, and it's so mirrored in the work that you do in treatment. I think that these are the kinds of things you're trying to achieve.
Well, and I would say don't be afraid to ask. Someone can tell you they don't want to talk about a topic, or as Bev has suggested, she's given some really great strategies about how to have those conversations. But what I've found working in them and having these discussions is that often people do want to talk about what has happened to them, and they do want to talk about, and they do know what they need to get better. And so I'm having the conversation or asking the questions, it at least normalizes that this is something we need to consider. We're not ignoring it, and we're not pretending that all is well. And so I would say ask the questions and have the discussion.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, you know, that's another thing, Bev, I'm sure that you've thought about in motivational interviewing, is being really willing to say, well, you know, I'm not sure. And, you know, let me have a look and find out more information for you, et cetera. You know, that showing our own lack of knowledge is fine, or, you know, saying, well, let's look at this sheet together and see what the folks at the Center of Excellence, you know, have summarized. You know, so just not having to feel like you know everything in order to start a conversation, I think, is really another important point you made there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can know almost nothing and still have the conversation. Because you can collaborate with the woman and find out together. That's exactly right.
So I guess we could wrap up now. I don't see that many more questions. There's one here. I'm still wondering if harm reduction in pregnancy will help reduce the effect. And, you know, reducing is always better than not, and increasing health in other life areas. Reducing stress, getting sleep, having good nutrition, taking prenatal vitamins, all those things matter. And I think that's, you know, that's my definition of harm reduction, is really widening the lens of the harms we're reducing and really thinking about health promotion. So, you know, really think it's an important concept in here. And yes, we will have both the recording of this webinar and the slides available for people on the Center of Excellence for Women's Health website. It'll take a day or so before they're up, but we will get them there. And really pleased at the huge number of you who joined us today to talk about these issues, and all the references we mentioned as well will be as a part of the slide deck. I didn't go into them in detail here, but they go on and on and on for pages there, so you're more than welcome to know that we thoroughly reference the work. Just one last thing I wanted to mention, the blog that we do on girls, women, alcohol, and pregnancy often includes other things as well about overall wise approaches in working with women who are using substances in the perinatal period. So I really encourage you to have a look at that blog, and hopefully there will be things of interest to you there. And thank you all for participating today.